Hello, and welcome to The Distillery, a series of online interviews. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun, and today we have special guest, Robin Parkin. Hey, Robin, how are you doing?
I'm great, thanks, Harry. How are you going?
I'm doing quite well, thank you. I am really excited to chat with you about a whole host of things, including friendship and community and social change activism. Robin, you're a facilitator in human-centered design who's involved in community organizing and activism, as well as music education. Can you tell me how you actually got to where you are? How did your interests coalesce into this?
Yeah, it's been quite a winding journey, and I guess it probably really where it started from was that from my upbringing, that I grew up in an intentional community in the Adelaide Hills, and so I guess something that if you haven't, if you're not familiar with that term, an intentional community is essentially a group of people who are interested in communal living, and basically this group of friends from the 70s decided that they were trying to break out of kind of the nuclear family and experiment with ways that they could be more connected, in the modern world. And so that was, I guess, where the foundations came from, because I was the child of one of those families. So then I guess of course, I was living in the world, and not many people, as it turns out, grow up in intentional communities. It's a little bit of an unusual upbringing. So I was stepping out of that context, and trying to think about what does it look like. What are the forms of community that can exist in the modern world, when I don't necessarily see that other people have had the opportunity to kind of grow up with the benefit of the kinds of social connection that I had in my younger years. So I guess that's kind of one big part of my story that definitely has a lot to do with the work I'm doing now. I suppose then subsequently you mentioned community organizing and social justice activism, that I became very involved in youth climate activism. And I think obviously at that point I was also studying politics and learning more about the systemic injustices that exist in the world today, and had the opportunity to try and support young people to stand up against some of those in the context of climate change and climate justice. And I guess how I saw community evolving in that context, which continued my interest in thinking about how different structures of how we relate to each other, was that, of course, a sort of a foundational thing for sustaining social justice movements, and really kind of motivating a group of people to take action on a range of social justice issues, is the relationships and the kind of containers that you set up that enable those people to connect with one another and form trusting relationships and gather around a sense of common purpose. And I saw how important that was in the contexts that I was working in. And I also had oversaw kind of a structural change within the local branch of the organization that I was working in, where those relationships changed, where the structures that were according to which we were organizing changed. And so I was really interested in how that then went on to affect our the sorts of things that we were capable of doing as a group. So I guess that was sort of one part of it. And I, if I try to wrap in another one, it would also include, my coming out as a queer man, and learning more about what it meant to embody whatever version of masculinity was available to me, and what models were being represented to me in the world, and in particular how those affected the kinds of relationships and friendships that I was allowed to have in my life. And so all of those things really coalesced to an interest in community organizing, and also in the field that I'm now kind of affiliated with, co-design or human-centered design, which is about trying to evolve communities of people who are perhaps using a particular service, to be involved in shaping those structures that actually, have an impact on their lives. And of course, that in itself involves a lot of facilitation and setting up different kinds of community structures. So that's a very rambling answer, sort of some of the places where I've come from. But yeah, I guess that's a little bit of a background of how I got to where I am.
It's a really great encapsulation. It sounds like there's a lot of intentional and purposeful reaching out and thinking about the ways in which we relate to each other as human beings, whether that's in lessons and challenges of growing up in intentional community, to your research and work in community and containers for the purpose of activism and seeking justice, particularly climate justice. I do want to ask more about those things. We kind of left off there at the kind of what it is that you do. So you mentioned that you do co-design projects which aim to directly help people in different problems and scenarios. What kind of problems are you actually designing solutions for?
Yeah, well, so at the moment, my work is with a new organisation that's setting up a model of home care that employs young people to provide a range of older supports to older people who might be facing social isolation, or could be facing a range of challenges to their independence and well-being. And so really this came through, this vision came about as a result of our CEO sort of seeing these dual challenges of youth unemployment and social isolation for older people. And so my role is in trying to involve both parties in shaping up what this project is going to look like. And so last year, I facilitated with my colleagues I guess you'd call it a sort of a co-design trial where we actually ran a version of this service in a local area of Melbourne, and we involved the people who were participating in that trial in a series of workshops where we were able to get feedback from them about what they what was working in, from their structure, if there were things that they wanted that were not part of it. And that was in the lead up to our becoming accredited as a home care provider, so that now we can provide, connect younger people and older people in a more sustained way through the government's home care package program. So that's sort of one context in which I sort of applied this way of bringing people together. But I guess the other one, which is a real interest of mine, and which I've talked to you about before, is around understanding how people are doing friendships in the modern world. And that applies in a few different contexts. It certainly relates to how I think about the kinds of ways that we're bringing together younger and older people in the context of my new work. But it applies more broadly than that. So a few years ago, I did a project with a colleague of mine that was called Kitestring, and that was using design research and qualitative research methods to try and understand better how people are finding and maintaining friendships in the modern era. And that was coming out of both of our experiences of noticing some of the challenges that exist in the modern world. And so, for making friends and maintaining relationships. And so we spoke to a bunch of people and we looked at a bunch of literature, and we pulled together a bit of a report that just kind of said, look, here are some useful things that we've observed, or some useful strategies that these people are using to help them find and maintain close connection. And so then, having kind of got some little ideas about what that could look like, then the next step was to then look for contexts in which some of those lessons could be applied. And I guess I feel like at the moment in my work, bringing together younger and older people, it's an opportunity to start applying some of those as well. So that's been a real topic of interest for a little while now, is just seeing how people are finding and sustaining close friendships in their lives.
Sounds like there's a real through line as it connects to the social isolation faced by elderly people, and maybe the
Yeah.
sense of disenfranchisement that faces young people, broadly speaking. And also curious about like the unique opportunities and challenges that you face co-designing, where you're having to communicate really, in depth with these. It sounds like a very basic, obvious thing to do, but this isn't the primary design framework for a very long time.
Mm.
How do you find that process?
Yeah, it's very possible to do it in a way that just doesn't work at all. That's for sure. And it really depends on the kinds of questions that you're coming to people with, and I guess also the extent to which you're coming to a group of people with a problem that you've identified that they need to solve, or whether you're coming to them with open hands around, I guess, a challenge that everyone has identified affects them in some way. And I think unless you have really worked out what it is that, unless everyone is there on the same page about that, then you're not really going to get to where you need to go. You're not having an open conversation that's because you're already framing it as you've defined it as the designer coming in. And so getting that right, basically involving people in a process and giving them a sense of agency and control over, what comes out of that, how you, the kinds of questions that you're posing to them is difficult to get right. I'd say that is definitely one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's one of those things that as designers is an evolving conversation. If you're familiar with sort of community development, theorizing and sort of philosophy, that really emphasizes that if you're working with a community of people to solve, a particular sort of shared challenge, all of the solutions that come out of that process should emerge from them, and you as the facilitator, as the whatever you want to call yourself, community development worker, really are just about supporting them and supporting their capacity to grow, where they can identify the solutions and then take ownership of them. In the context of my work with co-design, it's often a real challenge. It's a real wrestle because to some extent we have identified that we think this is a problem, this challenge of old people's sense of isolation. We think that we found this solution around younger people. So we've already kind of defined the parameters to some extent about how far we're willing to kind of stretch what we're willing to entertain. So for example, if we were running a session with older people and they said, you know what, we actually don't care at all about younger people. We don't think that we need them. We don't care about youth unemployment. We don't want that. Ultimately, it would really kind of, it would force us into a direction where it would be a completely different organization. And so, and there are many, many contexts in which that is the case, whether that's you're doing co-design in the context of like developing government programs and a whole range of different social services. And so I think the main way, it's really important as someone who is trying to involve people and in ways that give them some power over the options that are available to them, of how you are deciding what is in the box, like what is open to discussion. And of course, that means having a great deal of awareness of what your own biases are, what your own assumptions are, what your own privileges are, that are leading you to decide, oh, well, this is as far as we're willing to go. This is as far as where, this is the amount of involvement that we can actually give to people. So I don't think there's a clear answer to that, and it's a little bit sort of case by case how you navigate it, but that is definitely there's a real tension around that, and I think there inevitably will be a as long as this is sort of co-design work rather than community development work.
Yeah, so it sounds like the very notion of what you're choosing to focus on and the boundaries and scope of your work in solving these problems is itself very intentional, that you need to really interrogate the values going into those conversations.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned briefly Kitestring, your work around how friendships work essentially and how communities might form. Can you tell us more about the findings of that project?
Yeah, I could talk about that all day. So I think what was really great. So I guess I have to emphasize first, this was a design research process. In other words, we were learning for the purposes of getting a few germs of ideas that could be applied and tested, in the form of, a little prototype of a new structure over here, or a new tool. So what we learned is, not academically validated, sort of data, but
Who cares?
we have found it. we found it very we found it very useful, and we've talked to a lot of people about it now, and who have also found a lot of the tools very handy. So I guess one of the really the key things that was useful was just we were interested, and this came about through talking with a guy called Craig, who told us about this particular way that he structures his relationships with his friends. Basically, a little structure that he put in place, which was all about just gathering them on a monthly basis. So these were the old church friends of his that he, had lost touch with, and he decided, do you know what, we really like these interactions. Let's try and find a way to keep this going. So they set up, and these are all male friends of his, and they set up a monthly, dinner thing where they go to each other's houses, and they call it their mandate. So they have a mandate to have a mandate, and what they injected into that was basically a sense of rhythm, and that just got us asking the question: so what are the qualities of a container that is conducive to sustaining close friendships, or and allowing them to endure over time? And so we kind of we felt like we sort of distilled it into roughly 3 sort of ingredients that you had to get the right balance of. And so the first one was this idea that you need a little bit of intention. In other words, if you're just there to do some activity together, and you get together and you do the activity and you disappear, and you don't talk about anything, and I'm sure we've all had experiences like that, maybe sporting clubs, or maybe perhaps school or university might be like that. We get in, there's never any opportunity to be like, oh, you're a person, I'm interested in getting to know you. You need a certain amount of that in there. And when it comes down to it, that's really just about conversation. And so when we're thinking about the containers that our friendships exist in, there has to be space for that. But on the other hand, you can have too much of that. If it's not a really trusting relationship, having an extremely intentional conversation is very, very stressful. It's not much fun. Sometimes I think about, like first dates, say you go straight to the restaurant with the person, can be like that, because literally the only reason you are there is to get to know each other. It's not the best example, because at least you've got the food to distract you a little bit, but it's still a very intentional conversation. So sometimes what you need is what we refer to as air. In other words, just something else that you can talk about, that you can look at.
So just to clarify, is this the second of the 3 things?
This is the second thing, yeah. So really, and as a nice metaphor, it's kind of like, if you think about looking at someone, you can look at someone in the eye for an hour and it will be really uncomfortable. What you need is the capacity to look away from time to time. And that kind of ease, that easy come and go is really important, and getting the balance right. And really that's about trust, like how much trust you have in the relationship. And then the final part of it, which is a little bit obvious, is around the rhythm of your interactions. You know, if you are, that's number 3, if you're interested in sustaining a relationship, but you have to constantly initiate every single interaction, it's just very difficult. And also you automatically inject a huge amount of intention, which, you know, can be very stressful. And so, you know, because you're saying, let's catch up, we have no other reason to catch up except that I want to, you know, I want to see you. And that creates, you know, a little bit of a more pressured environment. So whereas if you even just create, as these guys did with their monthly dinner dates, you know, a structured catch up, you know, arbitrarily, you know, you can it's yeah, it's just, it creates for a more sustainable sort of structure for holding your friendships in. And so we felt like usually if you kind of got the balance of those things right, and it's not the same for every single friendship, you could kind of think a little bit more deliberately about, you know, how the kinds of environments that your friendships were existing in.
I think
So
that's
that's
really
just one
resonant.
of the key ones. But yeah, there are a couple of other things, but that's, I think, one of the topics that, or, you know, the sort of insights that people often find quite useful. Sorry, you were saying?
Oh, just that I think it's really resonant to me, and I'm sure to a lot of people, that the structures, the containers, as you put it, of friendships in our lives rely on the right amount of intention, on air that is like that other activity that allows for us to breathe and not be too intense, and the rhythm of it, that structure that repeats. So that's a really great articulation of what enables friendships to thrive and exist. How does that framework either like break down or change or even like amplify? It's not the grammatically correct way to put it, but you know what I mean. In this pandemic that we find ourselves in COVID-19 conditions.
That's, yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's, so hold on a second, I wrote down some notes about what I had to say about this.
Oh, I love it. Prepared.
Well, what I was thinking about is that, so in some ways, like if you're someone who has children or a family, you know, that you otherwise, you know, might, you know, finding time together could be a struggle because you've got pressures of work, or you're running around, and maybe you've got a long commute. Actually, what has been created is by being forced to work from home for many people, for those, you know, who are fortunate enough not to have been affected, you know, had their employment affected, is actually a new container for those relationships. And, you know, many people are, you know, finding they've got more time for their children and, you know, for the relationships in their home, because they no longer have to commute long hours to work. And that's why, of course, there's so much discussion around this, people continuing to work from home after the pandemic. So I think in some ways, like as a positive, for those kinds of friendships, it really does actually, it creates rhythm, for one thing. And that's often like half of the effort. Of course, you know, not all home environments are safe, and that's another issue as well. But so that's, I guess, one dynamic that I feel like I can see using these sort of frames as a bit of a guide. One of the other things that I'd say is that, you know, for people that we can't see anymore, people who are outside of our household environments, for those kinds of friendships where maybe now it's almost exclusively happening on Zoom. One of the things about Zoom is that, depending on your meeting, for your reason for catching up, you know, if you're just organizing catch-ups with people over Zoom for no other particular reason than to see each other, it is adding a lot of intention straight away into that kind of interaction, because you're looking each other bang in the eye, and, you know, you're also, you know, very deliberately there to see each other. So, I think some of the more successful examples that are out there for how people are adapting this to make it feel a little bit more everyday is the ways that, people are creating different activities, that they can do virtually. And I'm sure that you have got, 100 of those in your head right now that you've probably done or planning or, something like that. And I've really enjoyed doing those as well with my friendships. So I think that's a bit of a challenge of some of those interactions. And I guess, outside of our interactions with work colleagues, perhaps, where we might be doing those over Zoom, and we've actually, it's a pretty good balance because, we've got our work to talk about, and, that provides a little bit of air to those kinds of interactions. You can kind of maintain that sense of ease. And outside of that, sometimes we also don't have the rhythm built in anymore. We need to initiate if we want to see anyone, because many of our regular activities, have kind of fallen to one side. And so I think finding ways, again, arbitrarily of structuring into our lives, like opportunities to catch up, finding activities that we can do together if it's virtually, are all things that can help us hopefully stay connected in a way that feels sustainable and safe and not too overwhelming.
I think lots of people are, as you point out, finding these new online structures, whether it's Zoom. I've got a lot of workout crew that I do morning Zoom workouts with, and that's been really good. And it's also interesting that this framework is really helpful for thinking about how we might create these new structures and sustain them. What happens when things go wrong? Like, what happens when the structure doesn't just dissipate or fade away, but actually starts to erupt or cause tension and friction?
I think one of the things that's, I think one of the things that I probably was challenged by in some ways by, thinking about this work was, for one thing, accepting that friendships don't have to last forever. It's actually okay if they have their time, and then, you perhaps they were good while they lasted, and then, a container and a new structure comes along that better works with you and your life at this moment in time. There's another kind of point that we talk about in this report, which is around this idea of, connecting through that, rather than sort of thinking of ourselves as connecting, to someone. Usually what it is we have this abundance of different things through which we're connecting to people. So, you and I originally connected through water polo. Now we're also, have the benefit of connecting through this conversation and other similar conversations. When I think about my family, obviously I have an incredible history through which I connect with them. And so sometimes things happen in our lives, our containers change, our contexts change, which can mean that sometimes those things through which we normally connect to people, whether that's work or whether that's an activity or, whatever it might be, or perhaps, we develop we might be having a family, and all of a sudden we've got this whole abundance of new connections in our lives that, radically changes sort of the, our center of narrative gravity, like, our sense of ourselves. And so sometimes, it's really important in those times to be really deliberate. And I've talked with a lot of new parents about this, about inviting, old friends into those new spaces, to help them understand what it is that's going on for us and enable new places where we can connect. And obviously, often we do that all the time. If we're inviting friends from work, for example, into our home environment, that's another point of connection, and it's about building those up. And really, the more of those you have, the more resilient that connection, that friendship is going to be. But sometimes, those do shift, and our priorities shift, and it's okay to let them go. as long as you're kind of building new ones.
Robin, I'm really glad that we got to reconnect through this chat for the distillery after connecting at water polo, as you mentioned. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for talking about all of these things, your research, your life. It's great to have you on.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Harry.
Take care. You're watching The Distillery, a series of online interviews. You can check out our website, distillery.site, find out all the previous episodes, as well as check out future guests. And you can follow us on Instagram at distillery.site or on Twitter. Oh, I've deleted the little Twitter handle. Well, you can just listen to what I'm saying. Twitter at distillery site. Thanks, everyone. Do check back because there are new episodes streamed daily. Take care.